The stench was so sharp and overwhelming that courtiers clutched their mouths and scattered across the hall, realizing they couldn't stay on their feet next to the emperor whose body already reeked of rotting organs. That man was Valens, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, once seen as the backbone of the army and the shield against the barbarians, but now a sovereign eaten alive by parasites and inflamed intestines that drained his strength faster than any enemy on the frontier. And this is not fiction but a buried truth, lost behind official chronicles that hid the real decay tearing him apart from within. Today you will hear how disease and parasites didn't just strip the emperor of dignity but slowly broke the governance of an entire state, turning his own body into an enemy he could no longer defeat. Valens became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in 364, sharing power with his brother Valentinian who ruled the West. He wasn't chosen for his military brilliance or political genius. He was chosen because Valentinian needed someone he could trust absolutely, and blood was the only currency that mattered when dividing an empire. Valens was 36 years old, a career soldier who had spent decades in the legions but never commanded them, a man who understood discipline and hierarchy but had never developed the charisma that great emperors needed. He took control of the eastern provinces at a time when Rome's borders were under constant pressure from Germanic tribes, Persian armies, and internal rebellions that threatened to tear the empire apart. His capital was Constantinople, the jewel of the East, a city of marble palaces and packed forums where hundreds of thousands of citizens watched their new emperor with cautious hope. Valens needed to prove himself worthy of the purple, needed to demonstrate that he could defend Roman territory and maintain the complex web of alliances and military garrisons that kept civilization functioning. But within months of taking power, something started happening to his body that would slowly transform him from emperor into a dying shell. It began with stomach pain that he initially dismissed as the result of stress and irregular eating during military campaigns. Emperors didn't have the luxury of regular meals or comfortable digestion. They ate when they could, often while traveling or conducting urgent business, consuming whatever food was available without much attention to quality. Valens felt cramping in his abdomen that would come and go unpredictably, sharp twisting sensations that made him pause during conversations or grip the edge of tables for support. He assumed it was temporary, the kind of digestive trouble that soldiers experienced regularly when they ate unfamiliar food or drank questionable water. But the cramping didn't fade after a few days. It grew more frequent and more intense, developing into waves of nausea that would hit him without warning and force him to excuse himself from meetings or public appearances. His physicians examined him in the private chambers of the imperial palace, probing his abdomen and asking questions about his diet and bowel movements. They found his stomach distended and tender, producing unusual sounds when they pressed against it. They prescribed various remedies based on the medical theories of the time, believing that digestive problems came from imbalanced humors or corrupted bile. They gave him purgatives to clean out his system, potions made from herbs and minerals that were supposed to restore proper function to his organs. They adjusted his diet, eliminating certain foods and emphasizing others that were considered beneficial according to ancient medical wisdom. None of it made any difference. The pain continued, and soon it was accompanied by something far worse. Valens began vomiting after meals, not occasionally but regularly, almost predictably. He would eat what little he could stomach, and within an hour or two his body would violently reject it. The vomiting wasn't like ordinary sickness where you feel nauseated and then expel stomach contents and feel better afterward. This was acidic and burning, liquid that scorched his throat on the way up and left his mouth tasting of bile and decay. The acid ate at his throat tissue day after day, leaving it raw and inflamed. His teeth began to loosen in their sockets, the enamel stripped away by constant exposure to stomach acid. He would run his tongue over them and feel them shift, knowing he was falling apart piece by piece. The pattern established itself over the following months and then years. Valens would force himself to eat because he knew he needed food to maintain his strength, but his body had stopped processing nutrition properly. Whatever he consumed would either be vomited up within hours or would pass through his digestive system so quickly that it provided almost no nourishment. He began losing weight steadily, his face becoming gaunt and hollow, his ceremonial armor hanging loose on a frame that was slowly wasting away. His skin took on an unhealthy grayish tone. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. What Valens didn't know, what nobody in the 4th century could have known, was that he was being consumed from within by parasites. Intestinal worms had established themselves in his body, probably from contaminated food or water during one of his military campaigns, and they had multiplied over time until they formed colonies in his digestive tract. These weren't the relatively benign parasites that many people carried without severe symptoms. These were aggressive species that fed on blood and tissue, that burrowed into the walls of his intestines and caused constant inflammation and bleeding. They interfered with his ability to absorb nutrients from food. They produced toxins that made him feel constantly sick. They damaged the lining of his gut so severely that it couldn't heal properly, creating a cycle of injury and infection that grew worse with every passing month. By the 2nd year of his reign, Valens could no longer hide what was happening to him. Court officials watched him turn pale and excuse himself multiple times during single meetings. Servants found him bent over basins in private rooms, retching up acidic fluid that was sometimes streaked with blood. His voice had changed, becoming hoarse and strained from the constant irritation to his throat. He coughed frequently, a harsh wet sound that suggested damage to his respiratory passages from inhaling stomach acid. His breath carried the sour smell of someone whose digestive system had stopped functioning properly, an odor that expensive wine and aromatic herbs couldn't quite mask. The imperial physicians were baffled and increasingly desperate. They had tried every treatment their medical tradition suggested. They had bled Valens regularly to balance his humors. They had adjusted his diet repeatedly, trying to find foods that his body might tolerate better, but nothing stayed down for long. They had applied hot compresses to his abdomen and given him opium mixed with wine to ease the pain, but the relief was temporary at best. They consulted ancient medical texts and conferred with physicians from other parts of the empire, but nobody had any effective treatment for whatever was destroying the emperor from within. Some of them privately suspected that Valens was being poisoned, that political enemies had somehow arranged for toxic substances to be introduced into his food or drink regularly. But poison usually killed quickly, and this illness was killing slowly, methodically, over years rather than days. What made the situation even more desperate was the political reality of being an emperor who couldn't keep food down. Valens needed to maintain military campaigns along the empire's borders. He needed to travel to different provinces to deal with rebellions and diplomatic crises. He needed to appear strong and capable in front of soldiers who would follow him into battle only if they believed he could lead them to victory. But his enemies, both inside and outside the empire, began to sense weakness. Provincial governors questioned his decisions more openly. Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier became more aggressive, testing Roman defenses and probing for vulnerabilities. Persian diplomats reported back to their king that the Eastern Roman emperor appeared to be seriously ill, possibly dying, which meant Persia might be able to extract concessions or even launch military operations while Rome's leadership was compromised. Valens tried desperately to maintain the performance of imperial strength. He continued attending public ceremonies even when standing for extended periods made his head swim with dizziness from lack of nutrition. He spent hours being dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes that disguised how thin he had become. His servants padded his clothing with extra fabric to make his frame look more substantial. They applied cosmetics to his face to hide the grayish pallor of his skin. They positioned him carefully during public appearances to minimize how much walking or standing he had to do. The entire imperial household entered into a conspiracy of concealment, trying to hide the emperor's deterioration from the eyes of soldiers, senators, and foreign observers who would interpret any sign of weakness as an opportunity to challenge Roman authority. But the parasites inside Valens didn't care about politics or imperial dignity. They continued to multiply and spread through his digestive system, creating more damage with each passing month. His intestines became so inflamed and scarred that they could barely function. His body was being denied the fuel it needed to maintain itself, and it began consuming its own muscle and fat reserves. His arms and legs became stick-thin. His ribs showed clearly through his skin. His face took on the appearance of a skull with flesh stretched tightly over bone. The psychological toll was immense. Valens had been a soldier, a man accustomed to physical hardship and discomfort. He had endured forced marches, slept on frozen ground, gone days without proper food during campaigns. But those were temporary hardships that ended when the campaign concluded. This was permanent, relentless, getting worse instead of better. Every morning he woke up knowing he would suffer through another day of his body betraying him. Every meal was an exercise in futility. Every public appearance required exhausting mental effort to maintain composure while his gut twisted and his throat burned. He began to wonder if he was being punished by the gods for some unknown offense, if this suffering was divine retribution for sins he couldn't identify. His physicians had no answers. His prayers to various deities produced no relief. He was the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, one of the most powerful men in the world, and he was powerless to stop his own body from destroying itself. By the 4th year of his reign, Valens had developed additional symptoms that made his condition even more horrifying. His body began breaking out in open sores that appeared spontaneously and refused to heal. These weren't simple cuts or abrasions. They were deep, weeping lesions that would form, usually starting as small inflamed areas that would then rupture and begin oozing pus and blood. His physicians treated them with various ointments and poultices, but nothing made them close up. They would scab over temporarily, only to reopen days later. The wounds appeared primarily on his torso and limbs, creating painful spots that made wearing armor or even regular clothing uncomfortable. The connection between these symptoms and his digestive problems was clear to no one at the time. Severe malnutrition causes the body's immune system to break down and its tissue repair mechanisms to fail. Valens wasn't getting adequate nutrition because the parasites in his intestines were preventing proper absorption of vitamins, minerals, and proteins from his food. His body literally didn't have the resources it needed to maintain healthy tissue. His gums became swollen and prone to bleeding. His hair thinned and became brittle. Every part of his body that required constant cellular regeneration began to fail because the fuel for that regeneration wasn't available. His bowel movements, when they occurred, revealed the true horror of what lived inside him. Sometimes he would go days without being able to defecate at all, suffering from constipation so severe that his abdomen would bloat painfully and he would feel like something was blocking his intestines completely. His physicians would give him powerful laxatives that would eventually force his system to move, but what came out was nightmarish. Dark, foul-smelling waste mixed with blood and mucus, sometimes containing visible evidence of the parasites themselves. Pale writhing forms in the chamber pot, some as long as a finger, some shorter and thicker. Worms that had been living inside him, feeding on him, reproducing inside his body. Then he would swing to the opposite extreme, experiencing diarrhea so severe and frequent that he became dehydrated and weak, losing whatever small amount of nutrition his body had managed to extract from food. The parasites had essentially taken over his digestive system, creating an environment where they thrived while their host slowly died. They fed on blood from his intestinal walls, causing chronic anemia that made him constantly tired and weak. They produced waste products that were toxic to human tissue, poisoning him slowly from within. They physically blocked portions of his intestines, causing the constipation and bloating that plagued him. And they reproduced constantly, with adult worms laying eggs that would hatch into larvae that would mature into new adult worms, creating an ever-growing colony of creatures that treated Valens's body as their personal habitat. Sometimes, late at night when the palace was quiet, he swore he could feel them moving inside him. A writhing sensation deep in his abdomen, the physical presence of living things that had made their home in his gut. Whether this was real or imagined didn't matter. The psychological horror of believing you could feel parasites moving inside you was almost worse than the physical symptoms they caused. The physical suffering was compounded by the knowledge that he was failing as an emperor. Valens had major responsibilities that required his attention. The Germanic Goths were putting increasing pressure on the Danube frontier, and Roman provinces in the Balkans were vulnerable to invasion. Religious disputes between different Christian factions threatened to tear the Eastern Empire apart from within. Provincial governors needed direction and support. The army needed leadership and resources. But Valens could barely function day to day, much less provide the kind of strong, decisive leadership that the empire required. He delegated more and more authority to subordinates, which created opportunities for corruption and incompetence. He canceled planned military campaigns because he knew he couldn't physically endure the rigors of campaigning. He avoided public appearances whenever possible because maintaining the imperial image required more energy than he could consistently summon. His advisors began quietly discussing what would happen when he died, which everyone assumed would be soon given his obvious deterioration. These conversations happened in whispers, always out of Valens's hearing, but he knew they were happening. He could see it in the way his closest subordinates looked at him, in the careful way they phrased their advice, in their reluctance to commit to long-term plans that assumed he would still be emperor months or years in the future. He was dying publicly, slowly, and everyone was watching the process while planning for what came after. By 378, 14 years after becoming emperor, Valens was a ghost of the man who had first taken power. He weighed perhaps half what he had weighed when he was healthy, his body so emaciated that his bones showed clearly through translucent skin. His face had become a skull with eyes, his cheeks sunken so deeply that shadows pooled in the hollows. His hands trembled constantly, whether from weakness or from some neurological damage caused by years of malnutrition nobody could say. He could barely walk without assistance, his muscles so wasted that climbing stairs required him to pause and rest multiple times. His voice had been reduced to a hoarse whisper from years of vomiting acid. He still had responsibilities, still had decisions to make, but he performed these duties while feeling like he was already dead, like he was a corpse that hadn't yet stopped moving. The Gothic crisis that had been building for years finally exploded into open warfare. Germanic tribes revolted against imperial authority, and Gothic warriors began raiding Roman provinces in Thrace. Valens knew he had to respond with military force, but how could an emperor who was literally starving to death from internal parasites lead an army into battle? The answer was simple: he couldn't, not really. But he had no choice except to try. He was afraid that delaying would make him look even weaker than he already appeared. He was afraid that if he didn't act decisively now, what little authority he still possessed would evaporate completely. So he rode out with his army despite being so weak he could barely sit on a horse, despite his body failing catastrophically. The Battle of Adrianople happened on August 9, 378, and it was a catastrophe. The battle turned into a slaughter. Roman legions were cut to pieces by Germanic warriors. Thousands of soldiers died. Valens himself disappeared into the chaos of defeat, an emperor who had spent 14 years being slowly consumed by parasites and who finally died in a military catastrophe that he was too weak and sick to prevent. His body was never recovered or identified. He simply vanished, and with him went any hope of stopping what the parasites had set in motion. The parasites that killed Valens slowly over 14 years had accomplished what no external enemy had managed during his lifetime. They had hollowed him out physically and psychologically, transforming a capable soldier into a dying wreck who could barely function. They had weakened him so severely that he couldn't provide the leadership the Eastern Empire desperately needed. They had forced him into making decisions based on desperation rather than strategic wisdom. Modern medical analysis suggests Valens was probably suffering from severe intestinal parasitism, most likely a combination of different species including roundworms and possibly tapeworms. These parasites would have caused exactly the symptoms recorded: chronic vomiting, inability to absorb nutrition, severe weight loss, open sores from malnutrition, intestinal blockages, and the eventual complete breakdown of his body's normal functions. The parasites would have been contracted from contaminated food or water during one of his military campaigns. Once established in his intestines, they would have multiplied over years, creating an infestation so severe that it couldn't be treated with any medical intervention available in the 4th century. What makes Valens's story particularly haunting is how completely the parasites dominated every aspect of his existence by the end. They controlled what he could eat, when he could appear in public, what military decisions he could realistically make. They turned his own body against him, making it impossible for him to function normally while technically keeping him alive. They were with him constantly, feeding on him, reproducing inside him, slowly killing him while he remained conscious and aware of what was happening. Unlike sudden death in battle or assassination, unlike plague that killed quickly, this was a prolonged dissolution that took more than a decade to complete. Every single day for 14 years, Valens woke up knowing that creatures were living inside him, eating him from within, and there was absolutely nothing he or anyone else could do to stop them. He could see them sometimes, pale writhing forms expelled into chamber pots. He could feel them moving in his gut during sleepless nights. He watched his body waste away as they consumed him from the inside out, taking everything he had while giving nothing back except pain and suffering. They were inside him, part of him, inseparable from him, and yet they were utterly alien. His body had become their world, and he was just the landscape they inhabited, the resources they exploited, the host they were slowly killing. The historical sources that mention Valens tend to focus on his religious policies or his military failures, treating his chronic illness as a minor biographical detail. But understanding what he suffered through transforms our interpretation of his reign completely. He wasn't just an emperor who made bad decisions and lost a crucial battle. He was a man being slowly consumed by parasites, trying desperately to fulfill his responsibilities while his body failed catastrophically, making choices from a position of such physical weakness that effective leadership became impossible. The parasites didn't just kill him eventually. They shaped his entire reign, influenced every major decision he made, contributed directly to the military disaster that destroyed his army. In the end, intestinal worms became one of the most significant factors in the decline of the Roman Empire. Invisible creatures living inside one man brought down an emperor and helped push civilization toward collapse. Not through grand strategy or overwhelming force, but through the simple biological imperative of feeding and reproducing, oblivious to the empire that crumbled because their host was too weak to hold it together.